Next, we welcome Laoise de Brún, barrister and founder of the Countess think tank. Laoise has briefed governments and international bodies on law, policy and safeguarding issues.
Blair, my heartfelt thanks to Wicklow Women for this invitation to speak, and thank you very much for organising a conference, because I know what the amount of work that goes into something like this, and it's very nice just to come and speak rather than having to do all that work. Thanks very much. I'm just reminded that it was exactly 6 years ago that I decided to become an organiser. I didn't even know what that meant. I remember I had read Obama's book, and I was like, well, that's what I'm going to have to do. And it was off the back of a conversation with my children's godparents, where I brought up the GRA. Did you know we had full self-ID in Ireland? Do you know that means that a man can be sent to female prison? And everyone just froze and looked at the table. And I remember a chill went through me, and I said, you know, regardless of how you feel about this, we have to be able to discuss it. And so I started to reach out to like-minded people on Twitter, and the terror was palpable back then. You know, people were terrified. But slowly but surely, you know, we built an organisation, and I think it's good to kind of recap. So in terms of what we've done legislatively, or in terms of sort of constitutional amendments, you know, we did kind of raise the alarm and defeat an amendment to delete the word woman from primary legislation, from maternity protection legislation, to replace woman with pregnant person, pregnant people. And that was off the back of a campaign called These Words Belong to Us. And prior to that, there was another attempt by the government to install mixed-sex toilets in every school in Ireland. That didn't get to the chamber, but one of our members spotted a technical guide, like a design drawing that was into funding, whereby all secondary schools in Ireland would be either retrofitted or new builds would have mixed-sex toilets. I went on Liveline, and then there was huge uproar, and that was quietly dropped. And in terms of our legislative work, you know, I have drafted an amendment to the GRA. I remember, you know, brainstorming it and thinking we have to do something that's minimalist. So it's been introduced on the floor of the Dáil, and it's gone through first stage. You know, we didn't have time really to pull the lever of media attention for this. We would have liked to have the opportunity to do that. But it is there, it does exist, it's gone past first stage. And essentially what that amendment to the GRA would do is to unlatch Section 18, which is what the GRC does, unlatch that from the prison rules. So no longer would it change a prisoner's sex when it came to the prison rules. But what hasn't happened in this jurisdiction, what I'd like to talk about today, is we haven't had a test case. And when we look across the water in both directions, we can see how powerful test cases have been in terms of sort of chipping away and ultimately shattering the monoculture of gender ideology and its horrific influence across law, legislation, policy, the civil service and government departments. And I would like to see test cases been brought in this jurisdiction. So I want to talk about really how we can make that happen. What are the ingredients of a test case? Why haven't they happened in Ireland? So firstly, if we look at the sort of cultural and structural constraints on a test case in Ireland, it's really important to know the differences, the key differences between this jurisdiction and England and Wales. So for instance, we have a different rule on standing, on locus standi, which means who gets to be the applicant, who gets to take a case. In this country, the bar is higher. So in the UK, for example, in England and Wales, you can be, or in Scotland, you can be part of a group that might be or you know, possibly would be impacted. You can be representative of a class of person. But in Ireland, you have to be personally impacted. You must show that this policy or this decision adversely personally impacted you. So the bar is a lot higher in this country. Another huge impediment for a test case in this country is adverse costs. Adverse costs means, we just have a rule that costs follow the event. So if you lose, you pay the other side's fees. You might have heard about this only this week because of the UCD rape case in the JR that ensued, whereby that girl has to pay, because she lost in court, she has to pay the other side's legal fees. And that is, obviously, just broadly speaking, there's a huge access to justice issue in this country. It's the reason that a huge swathe of Middle Ireland, arguably the people who are using the services and paying into the country, into the society, are not taking test cases. It would be the men and women of straw, as we call them in the law, people who don't have a property they could lose, who aren't paying a mortgage. Or it will be the multi-millionaires who maybe arguably aren't as much embroiled in sort of the day-to-day life and the policies and how they would be impacted by them. So that is one kind of anomaly really in Ireland. We do have, as you probably would be aware, we do have a huge NGO section, and they have taken test cases in the past, like most notoriously, FLAC obviously funded the Foy case, which is why we have the GRA in Ireland. But I don't see any of them funding a test case from our side anytime soon. We don't really have a low bono, pro bono culture in Ireland. There is a pro bono, low bono arm of the Bar Council of Ireland. It's called the Vocational Access Scheme. I go to their conference every year, and this year I wrote them a long email suggesting myself as a speaker and sort of telling them, why aren't you talking about the intersection of the Gender Recognition Act, Gender Self-ID, and equality legislation? Because that's the conflict of rights. That's where the conflict of rights reside, and that is, after all, being litigated in the Supreme Court in the US currently, and has been litigated in the Supreme Court by Women for Scotland successfully. And so my argument was, the Bar Council and a conference held by the Bar Council should offer thought leadership. This is a conflict of rights, an emergent area of law, and the Bar Council should be, bringing forth excellence and knowledge on that. And then, I was also saying that it's the job of the Bar of Ireland to be independent, not to amplify government policy. As I press send, I say goodbye to my career progression. No, I jest, but hopefully not. But this is the culture that I'm trying to kind of explain today. There is, I think, unfortunately, like in the past, we had a Supreme Court in Ireland in the 60s that was, quite radical. But those days are gone, and like if you were to bring a test case today, you would be bringing a novel argument. It would be a novel argument that hasn't been heard before. So you would be hopeful that the High Court judge that you come before, is prepared to go out on a limb for you. You would have to have a very, very seasoned and surgical silk that would be prepared to make that novel argument for you. And like in the past, judges just retired, but nowadays they are careerists, they go on panels. So in order to do that and to keep going with their careers, they have to sort of cleave to the orthodoxy or toe the line. And so I don't want to be too pessimistic. I'm just trying to map out the kind of the impediments, as I see them. So in terms of, a test case, what would a test case look like? So I'm sure you've heard all day about the conflict of rights. That's what it certainly is. That's what the crux of all of this is. How the GRA, gender self-ID, intersects with equality legislation, and because that's where our sex-based rights reside. But anyone who's done any thinking about this can see very clearly that there's no, whilst they allow for the provision of single-sex spaces, they're not compulsory. You can't vindicate them. So I would be thinking more in terms of looking for rights as they reside in the Constitution and vindicating those rights. But then in terms of taking that case, you're impugning the GRA. So you're basically arguing that it's unconstitutional because of personal rights that are being infringed. And so in terms of the cost of that and what that would involve, to take a constitutional challenge, I mean, you mightn't see a court for 3 years. you would need a war chest, I think 200,000. There are other slimmer ways to do this. Obviously in our neighbouring jurisdiction there's been many successful judicial reviews. Judicial reviews are very specific, so they're highly narrow focused. You're not interrogating the merit of a policy, you're just saying to the person, the minister or the public body, that you didn't follow your own rules. But they can be highly effective. I mean, it was the JOR, obviously, with Kira Bell as the applicant that led to the closure of the TAVI. So a judicial review, I think you would need probably €80,000 as a war chest, and it would take maybe probably 2 years, I would say. But then you could also look at taking getting an interim court order, and you'd have to argue that something has to be done now. There's a live issue that cannot be solved, and you can't wait for the substantive hearing. You have to do something now and get an injunction. That would probably only cost about 20,000, and that could be done almost immediately. So I think there are the sort of routes that would be open. In terms of funding, there was a decision last summer, and I think it's very hopeful for us in terms of crowdfunding being allowed for in this jurisdiction, and that has been another huge impediment to test cases, because as you will be aware, activists have been doing crowd justice funding in the UK hugely successfully, and they've been able to get the money they needed just from people giving 5 or 10 or 20, 30. We haven't seen that yet in Ireland, but there was a decision in the High Court last summer where the judge went through really what the very old classic law against maintenance means, and he seemed to, in his reasoning, exclude crowdfunding from this if it was altruistic and if someone was not going to gain themselves from a decision going either way. So I think the way you would have to approach it is to make an application first and foremost, and just have it out in the open. Almost make the application as a preliminary application, say that you are crowdfunding, and get that out of the way, and then go forward. So that could be another stumbling block. So I don't want to sound negative in any way, because I think after so many years, 6 years in my case, I think we are at the closest moment we've ever had in terms of a test case in Ireland. And I think there's going to be a good few actually, across the board, whether it's a med-neg case taken by detransitioners, whether it's to do with sport, whether it's schools. Schools are, as we all know, parents in Ireland have incredibly robust rights under the Constitution and under the 97 Education Act. And no one has yet tested them in terms of gender ideology being taught in schools and those parents' rights being breached. As we know, there's a lot of kind of secrecy and waffle around what they've been taught, so that no one can look at a piece of paper or a website that shows the actual policy and therefore the breach. So there is a bit of kind of cloak and mirrors, but at the same time, for example, if a parent says to, say, the headmistress, the principal, I do not want my child taught anything to do with trans ideology, I don't want them indoctrinated, and if they are going to be taught anything to do with this topic, you must tell me in advance so I can remove them. And if that still happens and you have proof that that has happened, you would have to have evidence, then that is a strong case, because your parental rights are being breached. Likewise, if, for example, your daughter loses out on her place on the girls' sports team, a sports team to a boy who identifies as a girl, that is a case for direct discrimination. I also forgot to say the court of first instance for any of these cases, in terms of rights being infringed, would be the WRC, and the WRC is low risk insofar as there isn't a cost issue there. You just have to pay to be represented, but there isn't. It's very low risk in terms of what, even if it goes badly. And I think it's probably a good place to start, because they would be forced to defend their position, and they would be forced to show the policy that they are basing their decision on, that has infringed the rights of that boy or girl in this case. So I think that, whilst it may feel that there are so many structural constraints, but the other thing I want to talk about is the kind of ingredients of a test case. So you need the funding, you need strong facts. I think there's a bit of a myth that, even if you lose in court, it's still worthwhile doing. I mean, any senior counsels I'm speaking to about any of these cases that I'm aware of about 6 possible test cases, they don't want to run them unless they think they can win. I mean, they really don't. So I think you need very strong facts, but you also need an applicant who's prepared to do this. So, I would argue that, anyone who's going to take a test case, they already need to have a kind of a little activist heart. They need to care that deeply. It's not going to take over your whole life. It's not like every day you're going to have to be in court. Fiona McInerney is disagreeing. Okay, fair enough. It does take over a lot. Well, possibly things are a bit more effective in terms of the list of the court systems in England and Wales. I mean, I do think it would take quite a while to get to court in this country, but obviously it would be hanging over you, yeah. Fair enough. It would be hanging over you for quite some time. But equally, you'd have all that time to raise all that money. There are 2 sources of funding that I'm aware of, and I only know about them through building up a relationship with each of them. And I know one of them is quite interested in funding a case, particularly something like an interim court order, which would come under their budget, let's say, which would be the injunction. So I think there are loads of green shoots here. There are loads of possibilities. We all know in this room what's happening behind closed doors. We know that girls are having to change before teenage boys in schools. We know children are being indoctrinated. We know girls are losing out to boys in female, track and field teams. We know women are losing their single-sex spaces, showers, toilets, changing rooms to men who identify as women or pretend to be women. So, it's happening all across Ireland. It may not be in the media, it may not be raised for us in the chamber. So I think really it's down to us. I really do. I don't think we can wait around for someone else to take this up. I don't think we can hope that it's going to go away either. It's really taken hold of our civil service, our government departments. I don't think it's going to go away. I don't think we can just hope for the best. And if you think about someone like Ciara Bell, who arguably had a severely re-traumatizing experience by going through that test case, but it was her courage that led to the TAMI being closed. I don't think it would have closed without her. I don't think we would have abandoned puberty blockers. Likewise, Riley Gaines, she went up against her sports governing body and popular opinion at the time, and for someone to do that who was obviously up at 4 in the morning training her entire life, it would have been so much easier just to sort of say nothing, keep the head down and say nothing. And I implore really Irish people today to just shake off that cultural impulse that we have of put the head down and say nothing. It's not going to serve us in this instance. I really think it's important to think about your children, think about future generations, because this is our time and we have to act. Thank you.